normally one might say, well, we should think about this conceptually, not simply in terms of someone's biographical details, but it sort of rings true that Lacan would not want to be in any way thought of as somehow a disciple of Heidegger or something, rather than his own, important person. But one thought that did come back to me, it was, I'd asked you earlier about paradigm of jouissance, paradigm of desire. And one very basic, however simplistic distinction would be the way object A is utilized. Object A, cause of desire. It's almost always about desire. I mean, okay, admittedly, in Seminar 11, object A emerges in terms of anxiety, so on and so forth, but it's object cause of desire. That's almost the definition of it, right? Whereas when we talk about das Ding, a bit like what we said before, we often think about this incarnated, massive, often lethal, sublime form of jouissance. And as we start to give examples of each, we start to see that separation seems to take, the mole on Marilyn Monroe's face presumably doesn't really incarnate das Ding, although it does incarnate desire. So one thought I had, which I haven't really thought through as such, but is that ultimately one possible reason why Lacan eventually prioritizes and prefers object A is that you could say psychoanalysis is a praxis of desire. Certainly when working with neurotic patients, it's not really a praxis of jouissance. I mean, we have to work within the domain of jouissance, and jouissance is always there, but one seems to prioritize as an analytical and practical and technical facet of the work, desire, rather than jouissance. And if that's the case, and I'm just coming up with this now, I don't know, one would have another reason why the notion of object A might be prioritized in a slightly different way, because it would link us always back to the perennial importance of desire rather than merely the notion of jouissance. That may not be a good enough answer because, of course, jouissance becomes such a prominent concept in later Lacan, but, just thinking it through. So I don't know if you had any thoughts about that, Rick, or whether I could just give you the one distinction, which actually resonates with a couple of your own phrases that Slavoj gives of the difference between object A and das Ding. So maybe I'll just quickly throw it at you, and then you can see if you have any thoughts. So this is from Metastasis of Enjoyment, I believe, which must be about 1994. And he says there in a kind of, he's got a self-interview right at the end of the book, which is the most readable part of the book, but whatever. The status of the thing is purely ontic. It stands for an irreducible excess of the ontic. In contrast, the status of object A is purely ontological. As a fantasy object, it is an object that is an empty form. He says a few more things. Therein lies the enigma between the thing and A. How can the surplus of the ontic over its ontological horizon convert into the surplus of the ontological? So there we have how he approaches it philosophically. Thing as ontic, object as ontological. I could give you a couple of your quotes of your own work where you approach it in a slightly similar way, but what do you make of that? Do you find that a convincing way of thinking the difference?
As it turns out, well, let me first say, before getting to that point, let me first say about the Heidegger connection, the Heidegger issue. I think Lacan was, to just speak of the man, I think he was not lacking in concern for his reputation, his legacy, his personal status in his followers' minds. I mean, I think not wanting to be kind of conflated with Heidegger had some ego in it.
Sure.
However, I also would want to, I think, give Lacan the benefit of a doubt and say, even more important and more decisive for him was not wanting to be confused with Heidegger's philosophical position. So I think his begging off, if I were to just try to fill in the blank, and of course that's what we're doing, we don't know, at least I have no inside scoop on why he apparently so conspicuously withdraws from das Ding. I don't know why he does that. but my guess is that it has a lot to do with wanting to avoid a confusion, which really would take the essence of what he's after out of the discussion and sort of leave it in Heidegger's bailiwick, which he does not want to get sort of trapped in. Anyway, having said that, the more important question about Žižek's little essay in the self-interview, and I have to reassure your auditors that Derek and I did not arrange this. I just wrote a piece about that very part of the self-interview, where I basically say, this is in a book that's forthcoming. I've forgotten exactly the name of it. It's something about, the original title was Žižek and His Critics, I think. Now it's something else. I don't know. It's going to be edited by Todd McGowan and Dominic Finkel, I believe. Anyway, it's in the essay, I try to say, look, when I read this little self-interview, which relegates the objet A to the ontological and das Ding to the merely ontic, I don't want to simply reverse the roles. I do not think that the objet A is merely ontic. It's not a mere thing lying around the world of our familiar involvements, as Heidegger might put it. But I do want to maintain that das Ding is profoundly ontological. It seems to me, and I simply sort of challenge Slavoj on this point to say, I don't buy that. I don't think that was Lacan's intention. As I read what he was after in the ethics seminar, what he's trying to open up is precisely the key for, or the kind of aperture on the fundamental ontological question for the human subject. That's what's at stake. And it's crucial that this opening, this aperture on the question of being and nothing, is located in the other. That's what gives, to my mind, that's what restores Lacan's kind of cardinal declaration that human desire is the desire of the other. That's what gives it its weight. That's what gives it its kind of interest, is that it is ultimately not merely preferences, it's ontology. It's ontology in very, very much including, as Heidegger does, ontology absolutely including non-being. So by the way, Žižek then wrote a sort of rebuttal saying, no, Boothby, you're wrong again. So that little exchange will come out in a little while.
Okay, I'm very grateful for your time, Rick. So if you don't mind, I have just two questions. I'll keep them brief as possible.
Derek, can I interrupt 2 seconds?
Sure.
You may be returning to this, and I hope I'm not interjecting. I just wanted to get this in before we conclude. You talked a lot about jouissance and desire, and I would love to return to this, and maybe I will in some future piece of writing. But I think that one trap is to think that they are mutually exclusive in any way, and that desire, as Lacan, désir as a term of Lacan's kind of thought, probably the cardinal term in some ways, if you had to pick one, is so much broader in its meaning and more ample in its kind of significance and various dimensions than jouissance, which is dimensionless almost by definition. So I think one of the big questions of Lacan, of Lacan's work, the challenge he leaves to us is, to what extent can your desire include the offbeat, destabilizing and even downright threatening dimension of jouissance, as opposed to what for most of us in our everyday parlance talk about as desire as something that's almost over domesticated to the point of banality.
Yeah, yeah.
Absolutely not what Lacan's really after. So
yeah, I mean, for me, I mean, I think that's crucial for me. And I had some of these thoughts when you were talking earlier. Maybe a useful bridging concept here to bear in mind is, particularly if we think about anxiety, is fantasy. And so when there is a great deal, an intrusion of anxiety or an intrusion of the excessive whatever das Ding, presumably that would lead to certain questions, as in the praying mantis dilemma. And maybe what is most frightening in some respects about the praying mantis dilemma is not being able to, like, what does this other want? And what is the other seeing in me? So it's difficult to get an answer to those questions. But in as much, and you did a lovely thing earlier on when you were remarking upon, it's a familiar feature of Lacan that whenever there's speech, whenever there's a piece of language, it can always be responded to. But what are you saying to me by saying this? Mm-hmm. And what I liked about that is it means that this fact of speaking itself is a spur to fantasy, in as much as we think of fantasy as what do you want from me? And the ongoing production of questions, and more than just questions, prospective answers that would give me some stability and some phantasmatic coordinates with which to locate myself relative to these questions. So I suppose that's a long way of going about saying, yes, I think we do need to keep both desire and jouissance very much in the picture. And if we think about, let's say, ideological instantiations of jouissance, it's not just a passionate intensity. It's always a passionate intensity which engenders a fantasy, or which has a fantasy as part of it, a fantasy of what this means, or what, how great America can be, or whatever, which does bring into play a phantasmatic series of possible answers to respond to this. And if that's in play, it starts to become, I know some of the kind of more textbookish approaches want to say, bear in mind, there's jouissance and there's desire, don't conflate them. So I think we got that point. But it's also true that when there is jouissance, presumably, if it wasn't going to be so-called autistic jouissance that's completely formless, it gets linked to, it's given an armature, a framework of fantasy. And when that's in place, there's also desire, right? Anyway, so just to respond to you, I think we've got to keep all of those concepts, all those balls in the air at the same time, as difficult as that might be. Mm-hmm. But it leads me to then think, and of course, I'm disappointed in myself because I thought I had this nice breakthrough. Wow, we mustn't think, dusting too much in terms of desire. We need to keep it as enjoyment. But now it leads me to think, in as much as there is jouissance, in as much as there is das Ding, actually, there's going to be very potentially, if not inevitably, the engendering of desire as well. Because, and I was a bit cautious about this because I thought, well, we don't want to make desire simply the mode of defense or something like that. But desire is a mode of orientation in response to, well, multiple things, but presumably also that which is traumatic. Long-winded, sorry about that.
Yes, well, I agree. And I think that leaving enough semantic breadth and depth to the concept of désir is crucial, despite the fact that the opposition of désir and jouissance is also useful, to say these two things are quite different. And but yeah, I think it's for me I think one of the great motives for me, both personally and also intellectually, about the concept of das Ding is what I take to be its very profound resonance with jouissance, that it's the kind of aperture in some way of the jouissante. It's the kind of space of the jouissante, and it's off the cliff, you might say. It's through the window and out into something else that is at stake.